The dust of the Broken Spur Ranch settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to skin and soul alike. It was the dust of a hard land worked by harder men, under the thumb of a foreman, Jedediah, whose heart was as barren as the cracked earth. Clara Holt knew the taste of that dust better than anyone. At 24, she had the calloused hands of a man twice her age and an ache in her back that was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. She worked from can't see to can't see, her world circumscribed by fence lines and the bawling of thirsty cattle. She was mending a bridle near the trough when the horse came. It was a good-looking bay, but lathered and trembling, its eyes wide with a frantic energy. The man slumped over its neck was little more than a heap of bloody rags. He slid from the saddle, not with intent, but like a sack of grain splitting at the seams, and collapsed face down in the mud and muck that ringed the water. The other hands stopped, their faces grim masks of caution. Jedediah strode out from the barn, his shadow falling long and sharp in the late afternoon sun. He nudged the stranger with the toe of his boot. A low groan was the only answer. "Just another drifter," Jedediah spat, his voice like gravel. "Got what was coming to him, I reckon. Leave him. He'll be buzzard meat by morning." The men shuffled, their eyes downcast. It was the law of the Broken Spur. You tended the ranch's stock, not the world's strays. But Clara felt something shift inside her. It was not a grand rebellion, but a quiet, unyielding certainty. She looked at the man's hand, half buried in the mud, the fingers curled loosely as if reaching for one last thing. She thought of her father, who had taught her that a person's worth was measured by the kindness they showed when no one was looking, and especially when someone was. She set the bridle down. "I'm taking him to the old tack room," she said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Jedediah turned, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You'll do no such thing, Holt. You touch him, you're done here. You walk out with nothing but the clothes on your back." Clara met his gaze. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply walked to the fallen man and, with a strength born of years of hauling feed and wrestling calves, she hooked her arms under his. He was heavy, a dead weight of broken bone and bruised flesh. Two of the younger hands, boys really, glanced at Jedediah, and then, with a shared defiant look, they moved to help her. Together, they half carried, half dragged him into the cool, dusty dark of the abandoned tack room at the far end of the barn. Jedediah watched them, a thunderous look on his face. "Tonight, Holt," he snarled. "You're gone by sunrise." Clara did not answer. She was already tearing a strip from her own spare petticoat to begin the slow work of cleaning the stranger's wounds. She had made her choice. The dust could have the rest. The tack room smelled of old leather and forgotten liniment. A single shaft of light, thick with dancing dust motes, pierced the gloom from a crack in the roof. Clara laid the man on a pile of old grain sacks, his breathing a ragged, shallow thing. The boys who had helped her brought a bucket of water and a few clean rags before melting back into the shadows, their duty done, their own necks saved for now. She was alone with him. Working by the low light of a lantern she had fetched, Clara began her work. His face was a ruin. A deep gash over his right eye wept blood, and his jaw was swollen into a purple knot. His shirt was torn and soaked through in patches, dark and ominous. Gently, meticulously, she began to clean the dirt and grime away. Each touch was a question, each stroke of the wet cloth a small prayer. He was not old. Under the blood and swelling, his features were strong, carved from the same hard country as the rest of them. But there was a stillness to him, a quality different from the restless, angry energy of the other hands. Even in his broken state, he seemed solid, grounded. He stirred as she cleaned the cut on his forehead, his eyes fluttering open. They were a startling, clear blue, like a patch of winter sky. They held no panic, only a deep, assessing weariness. He tried to speak, but it came out as a cracked whisper, a mere puff of air. "Hush now," Clara murmured, her voice softer than she had intended. "Just be still. You're safe for the moment." His eyes stayed on her, tracking her movements as she dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and returned to his face. He was watching her. Not just seeing her, but truly watching. He observed the sure, competent way she handled the rags, the focused set of her jaw, the gentleness of her touch that belied her calloused fingers. It was an unnerving intimacy, this shared quiet in the dusty dark. She felt seen in a way she had not been in years. She worked for hours. She cleaned and bound a nasty cut on his arm and discovered the angry rope-burn welts on his wrists. Someone had tied him. This was not a simple brawl. This was deliberate, cruel. She found 2 broken ribs, taping his torso tightly with strips of cloth torn from a spare horse blanket. He bore it all with a stoicism that was more unnerving than any cry of pain would have been. He just watched her, his blue eyes a fixed point in the swimming darkness of his pain. When she was done, she propped his head up on a folded saddle blanket and held a dipper of water to his lips. He drank slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. The gratitude in his eyes was so profound it was like a physical touch. "Thank you," he rasped, the words finally finding purchase. "Rest," she said simply. She settled on an overturned bucket a few feet away, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak. The sounds of the ranch at night filtered in the stamp of a horse, the distant cry of a coyote, the low murmur of the other hands settling in the bunkhouse. Here, in this small, forgotten room, the world felt impossibly far away. It was just the 2 of them, the smell of dust and blood, and the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing, a little deeper now, a little more even. She had saved something. She did not know what. She must have drifted off, her head slumped against the rough-hewn wall. When a faint gray light began to filter through the cracks, she jerked awake. The tack room was empty. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed him. But the bloody rags were in a neat pile by the door, and the grain sacks where he had lain were empty. The saddle blanket she had used as a pillow was folded, a precise military square, and placed atop the bucket where she had sat. He was gone. A hollow ache bloomed in her chest. It was not anger or even disappointment. It was a simple, quiet sense of loss. He had not stayed to say goodbye. He had vanished as completely as a ghost at sunrise. She stood up, her joints protesting. Outside, the sky was paling from black to a bruised purple. She knew what she had to do. She walked out of the tack room, not looking back, and headed for the main house. She did not own much. A spare dress, her mother's mending kit, a worn copy of a book of poems. She gathered her small bundle and walked out the front door of the bunkhouse without a word to anyone. Jedediah was by the corral, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He held her week's pay in his hand. "Told you, Holt." Clara walked past him, her gaze fixed on the long, dusty track that led away from the broken spur. She did not take the money. She would not take a single thing from this place that was tainted by his cruelty. "I'd do it again," she said, not to him, but to the air, to herself. And with her small bundle in her hand and her head held high, she started walking. The sun was rising behind her, casting her long shadow on the road ahead. She had nothing. She was free. The walk to Sabinal Crossing was 2 days of sun and dust. The first day was an act of pure will, her body screaming in protest, her feet blistering inside her worn boots. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a canvas of bleached grass and thorny mesquite under a relentless, empty sky. She walked with a steady, plodding rhythm, her mind a curious blank. She did not think of the stranger. She did not think of Jedediah. She thought only of the next step and the one after that. At night, she huddled in the meager shelter of a rocky outcrop, the stars so bright they seemed to hum. A profound loneliness settled over her. But it was a clean loneliness, not the crowded, suffocating kind she had felt at the ranch. This was her own. She finished the last of her water on the morning of the second day. Thirst became her new companion, a dry, rasping presence in her throat. By afternoon, the world had begun to shimmer and wave at the edges. She saw the town before she heard it, a hazy collection of low buildings huddled by a line of cottonwoods that marked a creek. Sabinal Crossing, Hope or something like it, gave her a final burst of strength. She stumbled into town like a refugee from a forgotten war, covered in dust, her face burned by the sun, her lips cracked and bleeding. People stared. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on a sign swinging over a small boarding house. She paid for a room for one night with the last 2 coins she had sewn into the hem of her dress, a secret emergency fund her mother had insisted upon years ago. The room was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto the town's main street. She washed her face in the basin, the cool water a benediction. She looked at her reflection. A stranger looked back, gaunt and weathered, but the eyes were the same. They were her own, and they were not broken. The next morning, with her last coin gone and hunger gnawing at her belly, she walked the street, looking for work. She was a woman alone, with no skills but those of a ranch hand. The prospects were grim. She was turned away from the mercantile and the hotel. Finally, she saw a small, hand-painted sign in a window, seamstress. Mending and alterations. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and hair the color of spun silver sat surrounded by bolts of fabric. Her name was Mrs. Gable, a widow who had made a life for herself from needle and thread. "I can't pay much, Mrs." Gable said, after looking Clara up and down, taking in the worn dress and the calloused, capable hands. "But I need help with the rough work. Mending canvas, darning socks, the things that fight back." "I can do that," Clara said. "I'm a hard worker." "I can see that," the older woman replied, a gentle smile touching her lips. "The work is yours if you want it. Comes with a hot meal at midday." And so Clara Holt, the ranch hand, became Clara Holt, the seamstress's assistant. She spent her days in the quiet, sun-drenched shop, the snip of scissors and the hum of the treadle machine replacing the sounds of cattle and wind. She learned to stitch a straight seam, to turn a collar, to patch a hole so neatly it was nearly invisible. Her hands, once rough and clumsy with a needle, grew deft and sure. Mrs. Gable was a quiet observer. She saw the sadness that clung to Clara like a shadow, the way she would sometimes stare out the window, her gaze lost on the horizon. She never asked about Clara's past. She simply provided a steady presence, a shared cup of tea in the afternoon, and the quiet dignity of work. 3 days after Clara had started her new life, the bell over the shop door chimed. Clara was at the back table, carefully unpicking a seam on a gentleman's waistcoat. She did not look up. "Be with you in a moment, Mrs." Gable called from the fitting room. A pair of fine leather boots stopped in the middle of the room. They were polished to a high shine, not the scuffed, dusty boots of a cowboy. Clara continued her work, her focus narrowed to the tiny threads. A man's voice, low and familiar, cut through the quiet. "I'm looking for a woman named Clara Holt." Clara's hands went still. The needle froze in midair. Slowly, she lifted her head. He stood in the center of the room, bathed in the afternoon light pouring through the front window. He was tall and straight-backed, his shoulders broad under a well-cut coat. His face was clean-shaven, the swelling and bruises gone, revealing the strong jaw and firm line of his mouth she had only glimpsed. The gash over his eye had been stitched neatly, a thin red line that would one day be a pale scar. It was him, but it was not him. The broken drifter was gone. In his place stood a man of substance, of authority. Only the eyes were the same, that startling, clear blue, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. She rose slowly from her chair, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Mrs." Gable emerged from the back, took one look at the man, at Clara's face, and with a quiet, knowing glance, she retreated back into the fitting room, pulling the curtain shut. He took a step forward. "I'm Eli Cade." The name meant nothing to her. She just stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the man in the mud with the man before her. "I was investigating Jedediah and the broken spur," he continued, his voice even and calm, a practiced courtroom cadence. "On behalf of my company." He was suspected of rustling our cattle and defrauding homesteaders on adjacent plots of land. I was riding in disguise to gather final proof. He and his men caught on. They were more thorough than I anticipated. A dry, humorless smile touched his lips for a second. He was a cattle broker. Not just any broker. Clara had heard the name whispered in town. Eli Cade was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the territory. A man who bought and sold entire herds, who owned vast tracts of land, whose word was law in the cattle business. "By the time you arrived in town," he went on, "I had already ridden to the county seat. I filed my report. Warrants were issued for Jedediah and 3 of his hands, and I finalized a transaction." He paused, his blue eyes holding hers. "I bought the Broken Spur Ranch. The land, the stock, everything. It's done." Clara felt a wave of dizziness. The Broken Spur. Jedediah gone. Justice. It was too much to take in. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "The deed was filed this morning," Eli said, his voice softening slightly. "It's in 2 names. Mine and yours. I've made you co-owner, Clara. For the hand that saved my life, it's yours. Half of everything." He said it so plainly. A statement of fact. A debt paid. He stood there, waiting for her response, for her shock, her gratitude, her disbelief. But the ranch, the money, the impossible turn of events, it all faded into a distant hum. In the ringing silence of the little shop, only one thing stood out, a question that had been a small, sharp stone in her heart for 5 days. She looked at this powerful, confident man, this stranger who had upended her world twice. Her voice, when she finally found it, was not much more than a whisper, but it was clear and steady. "Why did you not stay to say goodbye?" The question hung in the air between them, more potent than any talk of land or deeds. It was not an accusation. It was a plea. It stripped away the cattle broker and the ranch owner and the beaten drifter, leaving only the man who had vanished in the pre-dawn light. His composure finally broke. A flicker of something raw and unguarded crossed his face. He took another step closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her face, and the practiced calm was gone from his voice. "Because saying goodbye would have been a lie," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "A goodbye means an end. And I knew, sitting in that dark room, watching you, I knew it was not an end. It was the start of something I did not yet have the right to claim." He took a breath, the confession seeming to cost him. "And because," he added, his voice dropping even lower, so low she had to strain to hear it, "if I had stayed another minute, if I had watched you wake in the morning light, I would not have had the strength to leave. And I had a promise to keep, a promise I made to myself in the dark, that the man who hurt you, the man who cast you out for an act of simple decency, would not own that land another day. I had to go. I had to go, to make a place that was worthy of you." Everything changed. His departure was not abandonment. It was a mission. It was not an act of forgetting, but an act of remembering. He had left not to escape her, but to come back to her. The hollow ache in her chest dissolved, replaced by a warmth that spread through her like sunrise. Tears she had refused to shed on the long walk, In the lonely nights, pricked at the back of her eyes. She did not let them fall. "The ranch has a new name," he said quietly, as if sealing his promise. "I'm calling it Clara's Rest." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her dusty cheek. She did not wipe it away. "All right then, Mr. Cade," she said, a watery but genuine smile finally breaking through. "When do we start?" He did not leave Sabinal Crossing that day. He took a room at the hotel, and the town, which had already been buzzing with the news of Jedediah's arrest, went into a fever of speculation. Eli Cade, in their town, and he was spending his time not with the mayor or the bankers, but with the quiet seamstress's assistant. Their courtship was a thing of quiet moments. It began the next day, with a walk. He appeared at the shop door just as the afternoon sun turned golden. He did not ask if she wanted to walk. He simply stood there, waiting, his hat in his hands. It was an invitation, not a demand. Clara took off her apron, smoothed her dress, and met him on the boardwalk. They did not talk of the ranch, or of the violence that had brought them together. Instead, he asked her about her walk to the town. He listened, truly listened, as she described the heat and the thirst, not with self-pity, but with a simple recitation of the facts. He watched her face as she spoke, his expression unreadable but intent. She, in turn, learned him in pieces. She learned the way his mouth tightened at the corners when he was thinking, the way he would absently trace the new scar above his eye. He was not a man of easy words. His conversation was like his person, solid, direct, without ornament. He spoke of cattle breeds and water rights, and the proper way to set a fence post. It was the language of his world, and he shared it with her as if it were the most natural thing. They often ended their walks at Mrs. Gable's small house, where Eli would drink coffee on the porch while Clara finished her chores for the older woman. Mrs. Gable observed them with a quiet, satisfied air. One evening, as Eli was leaving, she said to Clara, "That one is a stayer. He just took the long way around to get here." The town watched. The Greek chorus of shopkeepers and neighboring wives saw them walking by the creek, their heads bent together in conversation. They saw Eli carry a heavy bolt of canvas into the seamstress shop for Clara, his strength easy and unshowy. They saw the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, a look of profound, settled admiration. One Sunday, he hired a buggy, and they drove out of town, into the rolling hills. He took her to a place where the bluebonnets were so thick they looked like a fallen piece of the sky. They sat on a blanket and shared a lunch of bread and cheese he had bought at the mercantile. "I am not a man for poetry, Clara," he said, breaking a long, comfortable silence. He looked out at the flowers, not at her. "My life has been about ledgers and contracts, about tangible things." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But when I think of my future," he said, finally turning to look at her, his blue eyes clear and direct, "the only thing I see is you, not just at the ranch, but beside me, always." It was not a question. It was another declaration. Simple, solid. Clara's heart gave a steady, certain beat. She had been waiting, she realized, though she had not known it. Waiting for this man, this feeling of rightness. "You are a slow man to say what you mean, Eli Cade," she said, a gentle tease in her voice. A real smile, the first she had ever seen, lit up his face. It transformed him. "I've been told," he admitted. "I prefer to get the foundations right before I put up the walls." "Is that a proposal?" she asked, her own smile matching his. "It is," he confirmed. "I would like to stay, Clara Holt." "As your husband?" "Yes," she said. It was the easiest word she had ever spoken. Obviously, yes. Their wedding was 2 weeks later. It was held in the small clapboard church at the edge of town. Clara wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, one she and Mrs. Gable had sewn together in the quiet afternoons. She did not wear a veil, only a few wildflowers tucked into her hair. Eli stood at the altar, looking not like a wealthy cattle baron, but like a man waiting for his life to begin. He wore a simple dark suit, his gaze fixed on the church door, waiting for her. The ceremony was short, the preacher's words a familiar comfort. But the real vows were the ones that passed between them in a single, shared look as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. It was a look of quiet certainty, of a long journey ended, and a new one begun. The whole town seemed to be there, crowding the pews and spilling out into the churchyard. They were not just spectators. They were witnesses, affirming the rightness of this union. Mrs. Gable sat in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. After, there was not a grand reception, but a simple meal in the church hall. The women of the town had brought covered dishes, a feast of fried chicken, potato salad, and cakes. It was a celebration not of wealth or status, but of community, and of two good people finding each other. Late in the afternoon, Eli helped her into a sturdy wagon he had bought. Their few belongings were in the back. They were heading home, to Clara's Rest. As they pulled away, the townspeople waving, Eli reached over and took her hand. His grip was warm and strong, the feel of him as solid and real as the land that awaited them. 5 years later, the evening light was the color of honey, slanting across the porch of the main house at Clara's Rest. The raw timber of the old broken spur had been replaced or repaired. The fences were straight and strong, and the house itself was surrounded by a garden bursting with stubborn, hardy flowers that Clara had coaxed from the dry soil. Eli came out onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of cool water. He handed one to Clara and sat beside her in the rocking chair that had been his wedding gift to her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar, comfortable weight. The silence between them was as rich and deep as the soil in the creek bottom. In the yard below, 2 children played. A boy of 4, with his father's steady blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, was trying to build a tower of stones. A little girl of 2, with a cloud of dark hair like Clara's, toddled after him, her laughter like the chime of a tiny bell. "He has your patience," Clara said quietly, nodding toward their son. "He has your stubbornness," Eli countered, a low rumble of amusement in his chest. "He'll stand there until that tower reaches the moon or falls down trying." "Both, I expect," Clara said with a soft smile. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the worn gold of her wedding band. His hands were still the hands of a man who worked, but the calluses were from mending his own fences now, from building a life. "Do you remember?" he began, his voice thoughtful. "That first night? In the tack room?" "I remember," she said. How could she forget? "You were tearing strips from your own clothes to bind up a stranger you knew nothing about," he said, his gaze distant for a moment. "A man who could have been a murderer or a thief. You asked for nothing. You expected nothing. You just did what was right." He turned to look at her, the love in his eyes so clear and deep it still, after all these years, took her breath away. "I have built a great deal in my life, Clara. Ranches, fortunes, reputations. But none of it is as strong as that. None of it matters as much as that single act of kindness. Everything I have, everything we have, is built on that foundation." She squeezed his hand. "It was just a bit of cloth and some water, Eli." "It was everything," he said simply. Their son's tower of stones finally tumbled, and he let out a frustrated cry. Eli rose. "I'll help him," he said. "We'll get the foundation right this time." He winked at her, a callback to their long-ago conversation on the hill of bluebonnets. She watched him walk down the steps, his back straight and strong, and kneel beside their son, his voice a low, patient murmur as he showed the boy how to place the widest stones at the bottom. Clara leaned back in her chair, taking a sip of the cool water. She looked at her husband and her children, at the solid house, at the vast, peaceful land stretching out before her, all bathed in the golden light. She thought of the woman who had walked out of the dust with nothing, and the man who had ridden back to give her everything. But he was wrong about one thing. He had not given it to her. They had built it, together, stone by steady stone. That is the peculiar arithmetic of the human heart. Sometimes the bravest act is not a fight, but an act of quiet care for a stranger. It is a defiance of cruelty that asks for no reward and expects no witness. And sometimes a person's true character is not revealed in a grand declaration, but in the simple, searching question that follows the one that asks not about possessions, but about presence. For in the end, the strongest foundations are not built on land or in ledgers. They are built in the shared, silent moments, in the steadfast recognition of another's worth, creating a home so solid it can stand against any dust storm the world can kick up.